Welcome, everyone. I'm Brett Thielen with the Harris Center for Conservation Education. We're sponsoring tonight's talk. The Harris Center for Conservation Education is a nonprofit organization based in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire, where we help people fall in love with the natural world. And we do that in three ways. Land protection. We've protected more than 25,000 acres of land in a region we call the super sanctuary. A lot of that is open for hiking, birding, and other recreation, although there are a lot of roads in the super sanctuary. So it's interesting to think about that with regard to protected land. Conservation research, that's Phil's and my roles here at the Harris Center, both on those protected lands and throughout the region through a variety of community science projects. And then really at the heart of everything we do is environmental education for all ages, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities and all points in between. We have a really incredible calendar of events, everything from in-person birding outings and hikes and film showings to Zoom talks with nationally renowned authors like we have. It's really quite a thrill for us to be welcoming Ben Goldfarb here tonight. For those of you who might not be familiar with him, he's an independent conservation journalist. He's also the author of another excellent book called Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. He's the winner of the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. And his writing has also appeared in The Atlantic, Science, New York Times, Washington Post, Orion, and many other publications. And so we are just so thrilled to have him here tonight to talk about this book, the latest one, Crossings. And with that, I'm going to say, take it away, Ben.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Brett, for the introduction. Thanks for having me. Thanks for all you do to help salamanders and frogs and other critters cross the road safely. I'm so grateful for people like you and all of the volunteers on this call tonight as well, who are helping to create a better, safer world for other life forms. Well, thank you again for having me. Thanks again for all of you for being here. It sounds like you're having a busy spring on the salamander and frog escort front. Again, I'm so appreciative of that work. So this book that I've written, we'll be talking about, is about road ecology. And road ecology is essentially the field of science that looks at all of the different ways that roads shape and transform nature. And, roads are so transformative in large part because there are just so many of them, right? We have something like 4 million miles of road here in the US alone, around 40 million miles of road around the world. And there are something like 15 million miles more that will be built by the middle of this century. So we're in the middle of what scientists have called the infrastructure tsunami, this wave of new construction that's sweeping the planet, and of course having great impacts on wildlife. So roads, in addition to being ubiquitous, are sort of they're useful, right? We all drive on them, we all use them. They're how we get to schools and hospitals and grocery stores. And I think in part because they are so ubiquitous, they're such daily features in our lives. We don't think about them very much, right? They're somewhat invisible to us. We use them and kind of ignore the fact that we use them. And when we do think about them, we often think about them in fundamentally positive terms, right? They're these symbols of human mobility and freedom and movement, right? Everybody from Jack Kerouac to Bruce Springsteen has celebrated the romance and the thrill of the open road, which is somewhat ironic because, of course, roads do the exact opposite for other forms of life, right? They curtail animal movement and mobility and freedom on a truly massive scale. And because you guys are so engaged with animals, helping animals cross roads, you probably don't need any reminder of what a serious ecological catastrophe roadkill really is. But a few, I think, shocking statistics. There are more than 1 million animals killed by cars every day in the U.S., and that's just vertebrate animals, right? To say nothing of insects and arachnids. And I think that in part because the animals that we tend to see on the roadside are common ones like white-tailed deer and gray squirrels and raccoons, we tend to overlook what a conservation crisis roadkill is. But in fact, there are dozens of threatened and endangered species, listed species for which roadkill is the primary form of mortality, right? So this is really an existential threat to many species. And, amphibians are kind of the poster group for that in a lot of ways because, they're not very traffic savvy, right? They just walk out across the road, as of course you've all noticed, and unfortunately get hit. And as scientists have observed, roadkill is the leading direct human cause of vertebrate mortality. Right? There's literally nothing that we do that kills more wild animals on land than drive. I think that's a pretty staggering thing to contemplate. And of course, it's not just in the U.S. This is also, as I've said earlier, this is truly a global problem. One of the chapters of this book is set in Brazil, where giant anteaters are frequently roadkill victims, and in fact, that's their leading source of mortality. Right. So anywhere you go on this planet, roads are going to be one of the most significant losses of animal life. I think that roadkill is so catastrophic in part because it hijacks evolution, right? It's really subversive in that way. You think about the defense mechanisms of our commonest, most beloved species, turtles that withdraw into their shells, or porcupines that bristle their quills, or skunks that spray, right? These are all kind of hunker down, stand your ground defense strategies that worked really well for thousands of years against wolves and bobcats and all kinds of other natural predators. But when your predator is an F-150 barreling down an interstate highway at 70 miles an hour, the worst possible thing you can do is withdraw into your shell, right? So I find that really tragic to contemplate, the way that roadkill takes evolutionary history and renders it not only moot but actually maladaptive. So roadkill is, sort of the most conspicuous, obvious way in which roads shape ecosystems, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg in a lot of ways. And, road ecology, this field of science, looks at all kinds of different connections between, transportation infrastructure and the natural world. Roads are these vectors of invasive species transport. We have all kinds of non-native plants and animals that basically enter ecosystems along a grid effectively. This is, one example of that. This is an old logging road in Montana that I visited. And in this case, an invasive thistle, their seeds, so for many decades, logging trucks had transported the seeds of this thistle in the treads of their tires. And then, one day all of those thistles kind of bloomed at once after a big rainfall event. And you just have this, eerie purple linear stripe across the landscape. So invasive species transport's a big one. Erosion's another, hugely significant, form of ecological degradation wrought by roads. You've got all of these old dirt roads, of course, in many otherwise kind of natural and protected areas, as Brett mentioned. And, you get a big pulse of snow melt or rainfall, and, a lot of those dirt surfaces just turn liquid, and that slurry races downstream and, smothers fish or amphibian eggs and larvae and impacts water quality. So, certainly that, that geological and hydrological connection is a big issue. Roads are also these sources of pollution, right? Our cars are constantly bleeding cadmium and copper and zinc and microplastics and all kinds of crap. And we're learning more about that kind of chemical connection all the time. A couple of years ago, scientists in the state of Washington published this big study where they basically looked at many decades of salmon die-off, and they discovered that those salmon die-offs had been caused by a chemical called 6-PPD in tires. This chemical that had been added to tires as an ozone protection chemical. Nobody had ever heard of it. This obscure polysyllabic chemical that was entering the environment in the form of tire particles and was killing enormous numbers of fish. So again, we're constantly learning, sort of novel ways in which roads are impacting nature. One of those really important chemical connections is that roads are incredibly salty, right? We add 20 million tons of road salt as a de-icing agent to our highways every year in the United States. And, all of that salt is running into rivers and lakes and streams and turning freshwater brackish with enormous impacts on fish and amphibians and plankton and all kinds of organisms. That road salt issue is also a big roadkill issue in a sense, in that we know that, many animals are attracted to salt, right? There's a reason that salt licks are so enticing to wildlife. And we've basically turned our highway system into this giant linear salt lick, right? So what happens when, deer and moose and elk and bighorn sheep and other animals come to the road? That's obviously a dangerous situation. I will say that that road salt issue has inspired my favorite road sign. This is in Jasper National Park in Canada. Every winter they have signs saying, "Do not let moose lick your car." I'm not sure you could stop a moose from licking your car. I think if a moose wants to lick your car, he's probably going to do it. But that just goes to show, I think, how salty our highways have become. Roads are also these, kind of hellscapes of noise, right? If you're a male meadowlark or any other songbird who sings to attract a mate, and your mate can't hear you over the noise of engines and tires, you functionally can't live in that place, right? So, a road itself might only be 100 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet, that kind of acoustic envelope of noise pollution can extend, many thousands of feet on either side of the highway. And I'll point out too that road noise is a huge human public health crisis as well. There's lots of literature linking road noise pollution to increased blood pressures and heart rates and higher rates of stroke and cardiac disease and diabetes. I've really come to think that road noise is one of the great unsung ecological and public health crises of our time. But it's not entirely doom and gloom, right? Roads are also ecosystems in a way, even as they destroy ecosystems. And animals have all kinds of clever, flexible, adaptive ways of kind of taking advantage of this, novel ecosystem we've created for them. A few years ago, I went to Minnesota and checked out this highway overpass, and on the underside of the overpass were all of these crevices, and there were hundreds of little brown bats roosting in the crevices, which was pretty cool to see. So that there's an organism, taking advantage, exploiting the habitat we've created for them. Roads in some cases are also good insect habitat, or at least roadsides are, right? And so much of this country, our landscapes have been reduced to, corn and soy and lawn monocultures. And, the last sort of strips of uncultivated prairie are those roadsides. In many states, roadsides are the largest form of public land. And, all kinds of pollinators like monarch butterflies, they take advantage of that as well. Of course, that's also a dangerous situation for them. There's a risk of creating these ecological traps where we lure animals in, with nectar and other resources, and then kill them. And certainly millions of monarch butterflies are killed by cars during their migration every year. So, again, roads are habitats in a sense, but they're also dangerous habitats. And that applies to scavengers as well. Obviously, roads are this enormous source of carrion in the form of roadkill, and that becomes a viable food source for coyotes and weasels and raccoons and bald eagles and golden eagles and magpies and ravens and so on. Right. So the road it's a resource, but again, it's very dangerous. If you're a bald eagle with a belly full of venison, it takes you a minute to achieve liftoff, and of course, you're at risk of being hit by cars yourself. And the road isn't just dangerous to the animals who are hit by cars, right? Of course, it's also very dangerous for the other side of those wildlife vehicle collisions, which is us, the drivers. Mostly in the form of deer vehicle collisions, which are again another really, I think, unheralded public safety problem. And it's really just kind of astonishing to contemplate how frequently deer and other large mammals are hit by cars, and how problematic that is for drivers. A few kind of amazing statistics. There are up to 2 million deer vehicle collisions in this country every year, which is a DVC every 30 seconds or so, right? So in the course of this webinar, there will be dozens and dozens of deer vehicle collisions. The average DVC costs society more than $9,000 in and hospital bills and vehicle repairs and insurance costs and tow trucks and so on, right? So these are really expensive events, and they're very dangerous events. And up to 400 drivers are killed by cars every single, or rather, killed by deer every single year. And in fact, deer are the most dangerous wild animal in North America for that reason. Obviously, it's not the deer's fault, right? It's the car's fault. But I think that's pretty telling. And again, this is really an international problem. When I visited Brazil for that chapter, we saw lots of dead tapirs, and tapirs are something like 500 pounds. That's really an animal you don't want to hit. And the average cost of a tapir collision or any wildlife collision in the state of São Paulo is more than $9,000. So again, this is truly an international issue. So the way that we sort of almost invariably handle these sorts of wildlife vehicle collision problems is by putting up signs, right? That's sort of like the default solution for transportation departments all over the world. And we've all seen the kind of the iconic yellow diamond with the leaping black buck. And I'll just tell you what I think you've probably intuited, which is that signs really don't work. As some transportation department officials have kind of admitted, they're these very cheap, visible public expressions of concern, like, hey, look, we're aware of this problem and we put a sign up. But signs are just so ubiquitous that they kind of become white noise. They're visual pollution, right? And we don't really notice them anymore because they're just all over the place, and they're often not put up in any kind of systematic way. I think that's another big issue too. And sometimes you see this sort of thing, deer crossing next 30 miles, and what driver is going to remain alert with her foot on the brake for 30 miles, right? So signs are they're just not super effective. Nonetheless, again, they're sort of the default solution. You just see them for every species imaginable all over the place. And I certainly don't want to disparage the salamander caution sign in Brett's background because I think that they're good at sort of raising awareness about the issue and drawing more people into the cause. But as a solution to get people to break for wildlife, they're just not very effective. And in fact, I've heard some biologists call them litter on sticks, which I think kind of gets at the issue really nicely. And I'll point out too that even if signs were effective, even if they reduced wildlife vehicle collisions, those collisions are sort of only half the problem in some ways. And the bigger issue for at least some wildlife populations is this barrier effect that roads create, right? You can imagine a steady wall of traffic going along a busy highway, and that being a really difficult situation for an animal to successfully cross the road at all, right? So there are lots of highways out there, really busy interstate highways that don't have much roadkill because animals aren't attempting to cross to begin with. And that problem, that barrier effect, which starts at around 3,000 or 4,000 cars per day on a highway, that can be, again, in some cases, more dangerous and pernicious than roadkill. And I'll show you an illustration of that. So one of the places I visited working on this book was Southwest Wyoming, where there's this herd of mule deer who live in a place called the Red Desert. And scientists have, collared those mule deer. They put, satellite collars on them and kind of track them across the landscape. There's a deer being released with its collar. And what they found is that those deer essentially never cross I-80, the big interstate highway that runs through their range. So, if you look at this picture, those purple blobs, those are kind of like where the deer hang out, right? That's the deer habitat. And that white line running across the bottom of the screen, that's the interstate. And you see the deer essentially never cross that interstate highway. And that's an enormous problem because, in winter, all of the good habitat is south of the highway. So, in those harsh winters, those deer will kind of pool up on the north side of the highway looking for a way to get through traffic, but they just can't find one. And, eventually they stop trying. And in some harsh winters, up to 40% of that herd of deer will starve. as a result of that barrier effect. So again, a herd of deer, they can handle a few collisions. What they can't handle is losing access to hundreds of thousands of acres of habitat. And certainly that's happening to bobcats in New Hampshire and moose in Maine and all kinds of other species as well. Here's another, I think, illustration of this similar idea. This is the collar of a young male grizzly bear in Montana trying to cross I-90, and every single red X is a place where that bear approached the highway and basically bounced off like a ping pong ball, repelled by all of that traffic. And it took that bear 6 months to cross the highway, which he finally managed to do on the far left side of the screen there. So again, a road, I mean, this is I-90 in Montana. It's probably 150 feet from shoulder to shoulder. And yet it's this enormous form of habitat loss, really impacting wildlife distribution. Here's another slide, kind of illustrating, kind of the same effect. These are mountain lion locations in Southern California. This is a very famous population of mountain lions. Maybe some of you guys have heard of P22, who's the mascot for this population. What you can see is that these red lines. This is the 101. This is the 405. Right. These are two of the busiest freeways on Earth. And you can see the mountain lions effectively never cross the highway. So as a result, all of these mountain lions in the Santa Monica Mountains are basically trapped on an island, right? They're stuck in this little cluster, and there were no new mountain lions entering the population. So they're stuck mating with their own daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters. And as a result, they've become kind of chronically inbred and are suffering genetic defects. And they've entered, what scientists have called an extinction vortex, this kind of long-term doom spiral, caused by the inbreeding that the freeways induce. We've got these kind of two linked problems, right? We've got, wildlife vehicle collisions, which are a huge issue for animal populations and driver safety. And we've got this barrier effect that roads create. So how can we solve those two related problems? And, really the best tool we have at our disposal are wildlife crossings, right? These structures, bridges, tunnels, underpasses, all of these different features that allow animals to safely cross highways. Wildlife crossings really begin in Europe, in the middle of the 20th century. France built the first ones, and they kind of spread to Germany, Switzerland, Austria. The Netherlands today is kind of the world's leader in wildlife crossing construction. This is a kilometer-long Dutch overpass that spans 2 lanes of traffic and a railroad, which is pretty cool. So wildlife crossings kind of proliferate in Europe, and they really became famous in Banff National Park in Canada. And these are wildlife crossings that some of you maybe have seen because they are quite famous, and you can't go to Banff and not notice them, which is pretty cool. And these crossings, starting in the 1980s, were really built for grizzly bears. That was kind of the primary target species, although there were plenty of deer and elk and wolves and other critters as well. And basically, what these researchers found is that these were incredibly effective. That it took them a few years, but grizzly bears began to use them after several years. They crossed back and forth and mated on either side, so that kind of genetic isolation that you see in Southern California was mitigated by the wildlife crossings. They taught their cubs to cross, and their cubs became crossers. So there's kind of this cool intergenerational effect, and there have been dozens of published papers out of Banff about the benefits of these wildlife crossings, and they really helped this concept and this technology spread around the world. So here in the U.S., wildlife crossings really start showing up in the 1970s. It's at first it's really the Western states that do this the most. Colorado, where I live, Wyoming, Montana, Utah, and the reason for that is that here in the West, we have these migratory herds of animals, right? These big clusters of deer and elk and antelope who are moving across the landscape in large numbers and in very predictable ways, right? So if 1,000 mule deer, cross a highway at the same point in Colorado every single year, and 30 of them get hit, well, there's this big pile of carcasses saying, hey, put the crossing right here, right? And so there, these migratory ungulates tend to be pretty easy animals to mitigate for, whereas, in the Northeast, white-tailed deer are just kind of everywhere all the time, and so it's harder to identify, discrete hot spots for wildlife crossings. But that's changing, and eastern states are getting to this too, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So as wildlife crossings start to pop up, around the western U.S., a couple of key lessons. First is that transportation engineers realize that you really need fences, right? People always ask, well, how do the animals get to the crossings? How do they know to cross at the underpass or the overpass? And the answer is that really the fences guide them there, right? The fences aren't quite as as beautiful and sexy as the wonderful overpasses, but they're really key to making these structures work by funneling animals to the places where they can cross safely. And then the other, kind of unsung piece of infrastructure are these jump outs, these one-way escape ramps. So if an animal does somehow get through the fence, they can find that exit ramp and get out of the road corridor safely without getting trapped in there and getting hit by a car. So that again, like those fences and jump outs, they don't get a lot of attention, but they're really integral to making these wildlife crossings effective. Another really important lesson too is that you really need a diversity of wildlife crossings, right? I mean, most mitigation was done for the large ungulates, the deer and the elk and the moose. But of course, those are far from the only animals that are divided by highways. Of course, as you guys know, we've got amphibians and reptiles and rodents and mustelids and all kinds of other critters as well. And all of those animals fill different ecological niches and have different habitat requirements, and they also have different wildlife crossing requirements, right? So, there are some animals that prefer to go over highways. There are some that prefer to go under highways. There are some animals that need rock and log structures or brush, to feel comfortable crossing this big expanse over the freeway. This is a wildlife crossing on I-90 just east of Seattle at Snoqualmie Pass, and you can see that they've kind of like locked in these logs, which provide good structure for they've got alligator lizards, they've got western toads, they've got a whole bunch of different rodent species that all need that cover, right? So in this case, elk were sort of the primary species they were thinking about, but they also accommodated lots of other different critters as well. And they have different crossing types, right? Again, you've got an overpass for species that like, going over because they want the open sight lines. There are some animals that like more cover rather, like bobcats and mountain lions. And they've got these big, kind of capacious underpasses. You can see this kind of cool line of rocks that goes through the crossing on the kind of the far side there, and that's again really good reptile habitat, right? So just trying to accommodate the entire ecosystem is really important. And they've got these great enlarged culverts too, that are fantastic crossings for otters and beavers and salamanders and other kind of aquatic or riparian species, right? So again, you're just trying to think about the whole ecosystem. The enlarged culverts are also really good fish passage too. I think that's a point that's easy to overlook, is that it's not just mammals and amphibians and reptiles that are impeded by roads. It's also fish in many cases, especially in coastal states like like New Hampshire, like Maine, Massachusetts, places where there are herring and shad and sturgeon runs, Atlantic salmon. These fish they're moving upriver, and every place where a river crosses a road or goes beneath a road is a potential blockage to those fish, right? All of those culverts, those little pipes that streams pass through are potential obstacles. The culvert kind of restricts the stream and turns it into this fire hose that fish can't pass against. And so tearing out those old culverts, those narrow corrugated metal pipes, and replacing them with bigger sort of enlarged box culverts is a really important thing we can do for both aquatic and terrestrial wildlife. And here's just a cool illustration of that. This is a new culvert and large box box culvert outside of Seattle, and there in the bottom left corner of the screen is the chum salmon preparing to swim through the new culvert to access its spawning grounds. So I think one important point about culverts that certainly applies to amphibians is that look, they're everywhere, right? And they're great potential wildlife crossings in a lot of ways. Here in the U.S., we have something like 2,000 dedicated wildlife crossings and something like 2 million culverts. And most of those culverts, really all those culverts, were built to pass water, not animals, but animals have figured out how to use them. And there are all kinds of things we can do to make them more effective wildlife crossings in a lot of ways. Here's one cool example of that. This is a culvert under Highway 93 in Montana, and half the year there's water in the bottom of this culvert, which means that mammals like weasels and bobcats and raccoons don't really want to use it when it's half submerged like that. So here these biologists built what's known as a critter shelf, this cool metal catwalk that runs through the culvert and gets a huge amount of use by small mammals, right? So there's not every wildlife crossing project has to be a $5 million overpass. There's so much we can do with the existing infrastructure that's already on the landscape, through little cheap tweaks and retrofits. And I'll show you one other, cool illustration of that point. I mentioned earlier that, historically it's been the kind of the Western states who have done a lot of this work, but the Eastern states are pretty quickly catching up. And one of the places that's doing a lot of great work is Virginia. So this project, this is I-64, which is it's kind of a white-tailed deer and black bear collision hotspot. And so in this case, they didn't want to build new wildlife crossings, but they had a couple of existing culverts, these stream crossings, these seasonal stream crossings that were on the landscape. And so the Department of Transportation basically said, okay, how can we turn these existing culverts into effective wildlife crossings? And so what they did was they basically fenced the roadside on either side of the culverts and essentially kept the deer and other animals off the highway and forced them to use those crossings, right? So when they fenced that roadway or that roadside rather, they reduced animal collisions by 92%, which is great. They saw a 4-fold increase in deer usage, right? So they're forcing deer to use those culverts and taking, existing infrastructure and making it good wildlife crossings. And because this was so effective, because they prevented so many of these dangerous, expensive collisions with deer and bears and other animals, that fencing project recouped its own costs in less than 2 years. So this was a really economical project, as well as a good one for wildlife. And I think that brings up a really important point about wildlife crossings, which is that they tend to be really good fiscal policy, right? Yes, they cost some money up front. Typical overpasses $5 to $10 million. Underpasses usually starting at $500,000 or so. But they're again preventing so many expensive collisions that they pay for themselves very quickly in many cases. So they end up being really good sort of policy from a cost benefit standpoint, which is why many transportation departments are excited about them. Of course, the problem with focusing on the economic benefits of wildlife crossings is that you leave a lot of species out when you do that, right? If all you care about is preventing dangerous collisions with large mammals, you're not going to build crossings for amphibians, which is why the work that you guys do is so important. I think kind of unfortunately, right? I mean, it's wonderful that there are so many people willing to stand in the cold rain on a March night. But I think in a perfect world, a lot of those hotspots would be solved, with amphibian culverts and tunnels, which we know are effective, right? There aren't too many fantastic examples of amphibian tunnels at least in the US. There are many, many more in Europe. But where they have been built, they're really effective, right? And here's a famous one in Moncton, Vermont, where V-Trans put in a couple of culverts and just they just saw incredible usage by wood frogs and spotted salamanders and small mammals and all kinds of other critters as well. But this was the result of many years of advocacy, because the state was kind of reluctant. The project got mocked on Fox News, right? Or, like, why are we spending millions of dollars to facilitate salamander sex? It was just it's a harder sell in some ways, I think, to create passage for amphibians. So that's what you guys are up against. But these sorts of projects do exist. They're incredibly effective, and we need a lot more of them. And I'll point out too that that other countries are in many cases more willing to build crossings for diverse wildlife than we are. Here in the U.S. again, we have this very deer and moose and elk centric view of wildlife mitigation, but other countries I think take a more conservation oriented approach to wildlife crossings. Here's a really wonderful and famous overpass for migratory crabs on Christmas Island, where there are these beautiful steel catwalks that get used by millions of crabs, going from rainforest to beach every single year, right? So it's hard to imagine, a crab crossing, here in the U.S., but this is sort of like the closest analog, I think, in some ways to amphibian migration. All of these small bodies, going on the march every season, and other places. I think other countries are more willing to deal with these sorts of conservation crises than we are. Another cool form of wildlife crossing that I'd love to see more in the U.S. are canopy crossings, right? Arboreal crossings. Obviously there are lots of animals that live up in the treetops, and they're not going to descend to the forest floor, and so they'd never use a conventional wildlife underpass. But we can reconnect these little forest fragments with rope bridges and ladders. And here's a squirrel glider, a little arboreal marsupial in Australia, using a canopy crossing. And look, here in the U.S., right, we've got flying squirrels and porcupines and martins and fishers and all kinds of critters that would very happily use canopy crossings, but we haven't built them because, again, we take a very driver safety focused approach to mitigation rather than a kind of a biodiversity one. So I'd love to see more amphibian crossings and more canopy crossings. And again, I just really want to point out, what a cool and exciting global movement this is in some ways. I kind of when I began working on this book, I sort of thought, okay, all of the really exciting stuff is happening in the U.S. and in Western Europe. But actually, I think now I've come to think that the exciting stuff is really happening, elsewhere, in developing countries that are building their infrastructure now and have a chance to kind of get it right the first time in a way that that we never did. So in Brazil there are fabulous wildlife crossings for anteaters and tapirs and capybaras and other critters. Nepal has some really wonderful laws basically requiring wildlife crossings on any new highway that goes through wildlife habitat. I wish we could say the same. Kenya's built giant underpasses for elephants and other species, and I think that some of the most innovative projects are in India. And what India has done that's really exciting is that as they build new highways, they're actually elevating the entire highway for many miles on these giant concrete pillars. So instead of having sort of isolated wildlife underpasses like this one, the entire forest floor essentially becomes a giant underpass, and the humans are kind of removed from it so that wildlife can move back and forth truly undisturbed, right? So I think there's a lot we can learn from other countries. It's not just the American engineers and scientists teaching them. There's it's kind of a multi-directional exchange of knowledge, I think, in a lot of ways. And I'll just conclude by pointing out that this is really an exciting moment, for wildlife crossings in a lot of ways. The 2021 Infrastructure Act included $350 million in grant funding to states and native tribes and other entities for crossings, and a lot of that money, this is the first round of funding, has been allocated, and a lot of that went to Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, Washington, states that have done a lot of this work already. But it was also very exciting to see Vermont and Connecticut and and North Carolina and Missouri and Kentucky get funding for crossing planning. It's the states that haven't really done a lot of this work before, but are starting to get into it now. Now there's this great new source of funding to catalyze that work. So I would love to see New Hampshire and other eastern states get some of that wildlife crossing planning funding in future iterations of this this Infrastructure Act grant program. So there's a great opportunity out there for wildlife friendly infrastructure, which is important because again, we're as you all know, we're in the middle of this enormous biodiversity crisis. We're sort of at the outset of this mass extinction event. The sixth in our planet's history that our infrastructure is largely causing. And as I said, there's literally nothing that we do that kills more animals than drive. And so it's impossible to deal with this biodiversity and extinction crisis without addressing our roads and cars and traffic. Here's an example of that. This is an underpass in South Texas, and Texas is home to the U.S.'s last population of ocelots. There's something like 100 ocelots left in South Texas, and vehicle collisions are 40% of ocelot mortality, right? Which is by far the most common cause of death. So that's an endangered species that we are losing right now because of roadkill. And if we can't help them safely cross roadways, we're going to lose ocelots altogether. So that's the task before us, right? Is to rebuild our built environment to save wildlife on this planet. No pressure, right? So with that, I'll just conclude by saying that if this conversation just got your road ecology curiosity piqued, I do have this new book out called Crossings that Brett mentioned. I'll say that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among other publications, both loved it, right? So we've got liberals and conservatives coming together around the shared cause of wildlife vehicle collision mitigation, which I say somewhat facetiously, but genuinely, I truly cannot think of an environmental issue that's less partisan than this one, right? That's one of the wonderful things about wildlife crossings and roadkill prevention is that it's truly something that everybody can get behind. It polls incredibly well. Something like 85% of residents of Colorado, where I live, support more wildlife crossings. I'm sure if you polled New Hampshireites, they'd say the same. I can't think of another cause that is sort of equally beloved by the hunting lobby and the Humane Society, right? So that's one of the really nice things about this issue is that there's truly something in it for everyone, whether you care about amphibian conservation or driver safety. This is something you can get behind. So with that, I'll say thank you all again so much for all of the fantastic work you're doing to create safer roads for amphibians and other critters, and happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was such a wonderful tour of all of the challenges and also possibilities for how we can make a difference. So folks, if you have questions, put them in the chat. A few have already come in, so I'll pass those along while other people are thinking. Constance is wondering about, you talked about kind of flowing water, flowing under roads, but she was also wondering about sometimes when highways are created, there's kind of stagnant water that gets kind of pooled up on either side of highways. And she's wondering about how does it attract animals to the roadside, or how does that affect aquatic animals? Did you see anything about those kind of not flowing water, but kind of created standing water near highways?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have seen a friend of mine did a study. I forget where that was exactly, but basically looking at those artificial roadside ponds created by the disruption of water flow, and basically found that they can be both good amphibian habitat and also ecological traps, right? That they're obviously really polluted environments, that they're filled with road salt and various pollutants from vehicles. And if you get a bunch of amphibians that are attracted to a little stagnant roadside ditch, and that they breed in there, and then it gets hit with a big dose of salt or something like that. I mean, that's a really dangerous situation. So yeah, I guess I would say that's a potential issue. But at the same time, I mean, that it is habitat in a sense. And I just read an article about this sort of the Green Roads movement, which is basically this movement mostly in Africa and very arid places, where basically water is scarce, and they're sort of using their road infrastructure to collect water, which can become irrigation water for agriculture. So just to say that there are some people who feel like that roadside water can be put to productive use, but I think in a New England context, I'd be concerned about those becoming ecological traps.
Yeah. There's a couple questions about kind of what we can do locally at our local level, and Lindsay specifically on that same front is wondering if you have any advice on planning and advocating for adding a crossing. What's the most effective way to kind of help move that forward? If you have any, if you've heard any stories about how people got these going.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I feel like I mean, maybe I'll just like pop this in the chat, but that so those amphibian culverts in Moncton in Vermont, those were the kind of the driving force behind those was a guy named Chris Slazar. Maybe you know him, Brett.
Yep. I do, yeah.
Yeah, and Chris, I mean, Chris is just a really passionate advocate, and I mean, and that was again a years long process, that began with amphibian brigades, just like you guys are doing, and I mean, I think that one key thing is to demonstrate the data, right? I think that if you're going to convince any transportation department to do this sort of thing, you have to have the data showing that yes, this is a hotspot for mitigation. So I think that that piece is really important. I think demonstrating community support, through a letter writing campaign potentially, or or events and outreach is cool. There's in the book I talk about. These turtle culverts that were built in Florida between two lakes to help migrating turtles, and I think that like the advocates for those turtle culverts, they generated something like 7,000 letters to the Florida Department of Transportation. So really, I mean, look. Unfortunately, in many cases, these DOTs, they don't really want to do this, right? Or at least they don't want to do it for the smaller critters, especially. They're happy to do it for deer and elk and moose, but they don't want to do it for the small stuff. And so you really do have to exert some pressure. I think that's important too. And then also if you can kind of like point them to funding sources, right? That's also key. There are so many grant programs out there. I mentioned the Wildlife Crossings pilot program. I mean, there's like the America the Beautiful Act has a bunch of money. If the Recovering America's Wildlife Act passes, that there'll be money in there for road mitigation as well. There are a million different state grants, right? So just if you can. Yeah, like find some funding sources and bring that to the table. I mean, I know that's kind of a tall order, but at least like, be able to say to a DOT, hey, here, if you want to apply for this, here is a pot of money that is going to help you. I think that's really helpful. But I'll just pull up that article that Chris wrote about those Moncton culverts, because I feel like that's just an amazing article that that has kind of the whole history there, and it's just I think a really good blueprint for how you might create a campaign around these things.
And I can also just add, I can share that here in New Hampshire, we have a transportation and wildlife working group that has the state DOT as well as state fish and game and some other folks sitting on it. And they are thinking about this and they are looking at those funding sources. So people are thinking about this. So in our state, and I also really, the grassroots effort and the data collection, I always say to people at our Salamander Brigade crossings, we can't carry every frog across every road. That's not our goal. It's not effective. But if we can use the data over time to demonstrate the need for things like road closures or hopefully ultimately tunnels like Chris did in Vermont, that's the goal. So participating in efforts to help collect that data, I think, is really helpful too.
Yeah,
My
yeah,
two cents.
absolutely. That's, I mean, I didn't even mention the, the road closure thing, but that, I mean, that's truly, I think that's the ultimate goal, right? Is can we get some of these roads closed? And that, and there's precedent for that. There's, Marquette, Michigan, they close roads for salamander migrations in spring. There's the famous Snake Road, is that in Indiana or Illinois, I think, that's closed for snake migration seasonally, right? So there's precedent for that as well.
Yep. Phil asked a great question. He said, I can attribute some of my own interest in conservation to counting roadkill on long family drives from my childhood. And I know, Ben, that you talk about kind of the grandfathers and grandmothers of road ecology did that very same thing on their drives in the 1920s from like a Model T. But he's wondering what made you passionate about this topic? What motivated you to pursue this book and this subject matter?
Yeah, first I'll just briefly say that that I mean Phil, I met so many road ecologists working on this project who got their start the same way, who were obsessed with roadkill as children, who taxidermied it themselves in many cases, and that ended up catalyzing a lifelong interest. So you're definitely not alone there. For me, I got going on this topic in 2013. I was, I'm a journalist, so I'm always looking for things to write about, and I was in Montana at the time, and I ended up, kind of catching wind of some great new wildlife crossings on Highway 93, and I got a tour of those crossings, and I got to stand up on top of a wildlife overpass, and it was just. It was so wonderful on a couple of levels. I mean, first, it was really inspiring, right? That, like we do so much on this planet to make animals' lives harder and more dangerous. And, here was this multi-million-dollar piece of infrastructure we built to make their lives easier and safer. And I found that to be kind of a wonderful thing to contemplate. And I was also sort of fascinated by the intellectual challenge of it too, right? I mean, how do you create a built piece of infrastructure that's enticing to a black bear or a mink or a bobcat, the whole suite of animals who have to cross, right? And who each have different crossing requirements and who experience roads in different ways. And so I just found that to be really fascinating. How do you get an animal safely across a highway? And so that was, so that was in 2013. I wrote a few articles about road ecology and wildlife crossings at the time. Then, beavers inserted themselves in my life for half a decade. But, then in 2019, as I was trying to figure out what the next book was going to be after the beaver book came out. And I think on some level, I always knew I was going to try to write a book about roads.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. That's great to think about. Todd's wondering about monarchs and wondering if the jury is still out on whether planting pollinator habitat along highways is a net positive or a negative for monarch mortality in terms of, I'm assuming, roadkill versus food and habitat
Right.
along their journeys.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Todd, it's interesting to look at Todd's comment to say that from the book it seemed like there was a lack of consensus in the scientific community, and I think that's true. I think there's a lack of consensus. I would say that certainly the bulk of the of researchers I talked to are on the pro roadside habitat side. There are some dissenters who basically feel like we're creating these death traps by planting milkweed along roadsides. But I think that those people are in the minority, I would say. Most of the data I've seen suggests that ultimately roadside habitats are potentially valuable, and that they are producing more monarch butterflies than are being killed on highways, even though a lot are being killed on highways. To me, I think, and I say this in the book, but ultimately, look, insects are going to use those roadsides, right? And unless you just turn them all into Bermuda grass and and spray and mow them constantly, they're going to be habitat. So I feel like less productive than saying are they positive or negative is saying, okay, how can we make them better, right? How can we maximize their habitat benefits while minimizing their potential costs to wildlife? And maybe that means planting them further back from the road in the rights of way, or maybe that means changing the mowing schedule to generate more productive milkweeds for monarch caterpillars. Maybe it means planting them higher. Some states are trying that, basically elevating, roadsides on berms so that, the butterflies are theoretically flying over traffic rather than through traffic. So, to me, that's kind of like the exciting next direction in the roadside habitat question is like, okay, how can we really, if these are going to be habitats, how do we make them better?
Yeah, those are great questions. Maybe time for one more, which Suzanne's asking about driving at night and she says, I try to limit my driving to daylight hours to decrease the chance of hitting wildlife on the roads at night when many animals are more active and it's harder to see them. Have you heard of any wildlife conservation measures that are globally linked with driving at night in order to decrease roadkill? Is this something that people are talking about?
Yeah, it's yes, I would say, look, there are lots of parks and protected areas in other countries, Brazil, where I visited, many African parks where roads are closed at night. And you basically have to get out of the park by nightfall, or you're going to be, the gates are going to be locked and you're going to be stuck in there, with the leopards and lions all night. So, I'd love to see that. One of my friends who works for the National Park Service in Yellowstone, he just did a safari in Kenya, and he had a very narrow escape where he and his wife were almost trapped in a park overnight. But he loved it. He's like, yeah, why are we doing that in Yellowstone? How come you can just drive around all night in a protected area, hitting elk and bison and grizzly bears and other critters. So I would say that globally, there are roads that are closed at night, but in the U.S. we are not quite that enlightened yet.
I always say when people hear about our salamander brigades, but they're hesitant to be outside on a 42-degree rainy night, that's not the only way to help amphibians. You can help just by not driving, just staying home warm and dry, and just on any rainy kind of spring or summer nights, that's probably in some ways better than driving to a road crossing to help them move across the road, if you can just stay off.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've reached our time, but there's lots of kudos coming in the chat, and thanks for this really excellent presentation. And for those of you who haven't already gotten the book and read the book, I totally recommend it. It's beautifully written, and incredibly well researched, and there's lots of great details in here on all of the topics that Ben shared with us tonight. So thank you so much, Ben, for being with us, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. And we will hope to see you again soon.